Hey guys, Nate from the future here. I wanted to add one quick little preamble to this lesson, which I taped last week. So I had the opportunity last week to meet the guy who's maybe inspired me more than anybody else this last year, Nick Smith. And Nick was pretty adamant that he didn't believe gospel chops were a real thing. Gospel is a religion, it's a lifestyle. What you hear drummers doing is improvisation. So I wanted to be careful to mention that I'm using gospel chops as kind of the word du jour to capture the type of improvisation that drummers do for church and that's inspired by church. So when I say like, what's the shortcut to hacking gospel chops? I mean, what's the shortcut to hacking the vocabulary that Nick and DeAndre Montgomery and D-Mile and Chris Coleman and Aaron Spears and multiple generations of these guys play. But whatever we call it, I'm sure we can agree that it's awesome and that we all want to learn it. So with that preamble, thanks again to Mr. Nick Smith, and please enjoy the lesson.
It's Nate. I'm back at you with another lesson of the week. And this week I'm killing two birds with one stone. I'm going to make kind of a long-awaited lesson and also do kind of a videotaped preparation for my clinic. So the subject of both is what makes gospel chops different from regular chops.
So what makes gospel chops, right? And Chris Coleman got the whole debate started with this clinic he gave that ended up on the internet.
What is the kind of essential thing that drummers like Chris Coleman and Aaron Spears are doing that makes them different than your normal sort of everyday rudiments? And before I do that, I'm going to play for you.
Of course, first I'm going to play for you just a little bit. I guess we get to do that every time.
There are a lot of categories of rudiments, and there are a lot of rudiments that we could deploy playing a drum solo.
There are rudiments that are kind of polyphonic, like where both hands are playing some version of something at once. For us, like this one, likes this one. Right? There are definitely like long form rudiments, like double paradiddles and triple paradiddles, and any kind of combinations you can make with those.
And we have flams. And I contend that gospel chops evolved for a very particular need, and that was to cut through a church environment without much miking with toms. So if you were to play a drum solo pretending you have no toms you were to play only with your cymbals and your snare drum, maybe sort of like a stripped down Chris Dave or Juliana setup, you'd probably play very differently than if you had toms. You only really have two surfaces to choose from. It's either the snare or it's the cymbal. So you're spending longer on one drum and you're punctuating using the cymbals. But when you start to incorporate toms and you don't want to simply be playing singles around them, which is one thing you can do, but you want to take advantage of the shortness and the percussiveness of the toms to just add orchestration to what you're already doing. Then, by necessity, you start to play this kind of Steve Gadd vocabulary, which leverages your ability to play, how do I put it? Leverages your ability to switch surfaces really quickly. So if you were playing the same drum solo with toms and you were trying to cut over a church, your original solo might sound pretty different. So I want to divide this into a couple things. Part one is going to be exactly what we shed to get there, to try to come up with. So the kind of permutations and maybe the DNA of gospel chops. And part two is going to be really practical, just how do you practice it? We're approaching things linearly where we have hands and kick drum, essentially. So let's just think about the different combinations. You can do combinations of two, which essentially only gives you one option. It would be or. I mean, you could do, but then you're going to have to balance that with either or. So that's not two, that's three or four. So you'll do what's called 1/1, which is one hand and 1 foot, or 1 foot and one hand. So that's just. Okay, so that's 2 note groups. 3 note groups, you can do 2/1 or 1/2. Right? Those are your combinations. So when you start to talk about 4 note groups, you get into more combinations because you can essentially do, two groups of 1/1. That's essentially 4. You can do 2/2, or you can do 3/1 if you start with the hands. And the last one I want to talk about is 5s, because then you can do like 3/2. Or you can do 1/1 and 2/1. So, and you can reverse that. You can do any combination of that with the feet. So the next thing to think about is how to orchestrate things. And there's a very particular way that the Chris Coleman Gospel Chops thing is orchestrated. And that's basically with some variation, but essentially in this shape, with the right hand starting on the snare and managing the low tom and the left hand hitting the rack tom. So what would 1/1 look like in that kind of most common permutation? It would look like this. What would 2/1 look like? And we're not just doing this John Bonham. We're going to get more sophisticated than that. Don't worry about it. What would 2/2 look like? And what would 3/1 look like? What would 3/2 look like? Okay, so within those, you can do a couple of variations. You can do, how do I put it? This. can also be played like, so can be, and can be. I'm giving my video editor a lot of fun right now. So for instance, you could also do, right? So maybe three really common combinations of 3/1 are and. So right away you've got a phrase. Yeah, you can do that too, but that's not what I was intending. So right? And yeah, you can do this. So that works out really easily too. Okay, so I'm not playing rim shots now, but in general, when you're hitting the snare drum playing these really tight combinations, it will be rim shots. So because again, the idea is to cut. So there are all sorts of shades of gray that you can do with this, but again, I'm just giving you like the very basic DNA of this. So you can take these elements and first of all, just start off trying to play them on the snare drum. So I guess this is part 2 now. We're talking about improvisation. So without even being super organized about it, I'm just going to try to make some shapes. I have an exercise in my coaching course where I ask people to do 4 and 3 note groups. Without really paying much allegiance to where they're landing, but keeping one straight in their head. And I'm going to do the same thing in 16ths with gospel chops and just try to do some of these combinations. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So basically that's gospel chops, right? And then if you try to orchestrate it, and I like to orchestrate it first without using the rim shots. So combination like I just improvised would sound something like 3, 4. Right? You can do that and then add rim shots. And I'm going to slow it down just a little. 3 E N to 4 E N. Right? So if that's your 16th note lattice, you can practice playing a groove and then filling over it. So doesn't that already sound like Chris Coleman? You speed that up. So that's the other thing. You can master this pretty easily, but the two rubs to it are, number 1, being able to improvise with it seamlessly, and number 2, speed. So those are interrelated. So you want to make sure that you keep it slow enough that your brain is out ahead of your hands. Okay, so now let's try a few of these in triplets. So 3, 4. Right? So now let's try them on the toms. 1, 2, 3, 4. And now let's play them trading with a groove. And I'm going to play the groove straight because idiomatically that's what happens a lot. So 3 E N to 4 E N to. Okay, so the last thing I want to give you is when we're improvising with these, you want to practice starting on the 1 and also on the 4. So I'm going to give you kind of an improv example now where I'm going to practice eighths and triplets. And I'm going to practice starting on the 1 and then the 4. See if that works. 3 and a 4. Yeah. Okay, and as you kind of expand out and practice improvising more, and especially as you increase the speed, you're going to use some of the regular rudiments like paradiddles and double paradiddles as filler in between your strictly gospel chops things. So, for instance, if I'm playing a groove at that kind of tempo, I'm not going to just necessarily go straight into the Chris Coleman stuff. I'll probably use some connective tissue. So that's kind of a crash course into the type of stuff that you hear me play, like if I'm playing a solo on Instagram. And I think this functions really well for both the lesson and the clinic. And I'm not giving you too many specific examples in this, partly because to do so would be prohibitively long, but also because the entirety of Module 12 of my coaching course is like specific scripted out examples of this with extremely specific improvisation exercises. And most of the modules preparing to get to that are these kind of connective tissue type of rudiments, teaching you how to execute them cleanly, execute them in time, and improvise with them. So obviously, guys, you've heard this before, but have to say it again. Been really flattered by the number of you guys who have downloaded the 80/20 roadmap. But I put that out there to give you guys kind of an intro, a gateway drug to my paid products, so that if you like it, hopefully you'll upgrade to the coaching course and understand that 6 to 9 months worth of structured instruction that'll take you from where you are now to the drummer you want to be for pennies on the dollar for what you'd pay a teacher for private lessons, and probably waste a lot of your time coming in playing stuff you'd already played for him or her. So roadmap will get you started. Pick it up there if you haven't yet. Dudes, thanks so much for indulging me in what was probably a pretty long one, but I think pretty closely resembles what I'll hopefully be talking about in my clinic. It's been real. As always, I'll be back next week with another lesson a week. Been good to spend this time with you. Anyway, one love. Peace.